Today we'll be going over the second part of Step 5 of translation, community testing. Remember that in Step 1, the translator does exegesis to understand the source text. In Step 2, he makes a first draft. In Step 3, the other translators on the team give input into the accuracy of the translation in the team check. In Step 4 is the reviewer's check, when the translation is tested with other believers. And now in Step 5, we want to make sure that the translation is communicating clearly and naturally to other speakers of the language. So that is community testing. Like the reviewer's check, community testing is done to ensure the translation is clear and natural. It's usually done out in the village area. And people are not comparing your translation against other versions to make sure nothing was left out or added, but they are trying to listen or read the text and make sure that the meaning is clear to them and that the language sounds natural. Is the correct meaning being understood by your target audience? The goal is to improve the translation. So any places they are able to point out where something might not be clear or unnatural, those suggestions can help you improve the translation. We mentioned before that there are different methods for doing community testing. In the first presentation, we went over the tell it again method for doing community testing. In this method, the translator reads or plays a recording with a passage of scripture. He then asks people to tell again what they heard in their own words. This can show areas where they did not clearly understand the text, or it can give the translators new ideas of ways to say things that might be more natural in their language. Now we're going to go over the second main method for testing, and that is using questions. We're also going to look briefly at several other tests that can be used. There are a number of different question words we can use that will help us get at different aspects of the meaning. For instance, who, what, when, where, how, and even why. A couple of times so far in this training, we have talked about looking at the big picture and then focusing on details. And that is also useful for doing questions for community testing. So to find out whether the main point of the passage is clear, we use what we'll call overview questions. And then to find out whether the details are correct and clear, we'll use what we call detail questions. Here is the method or procedure for how we will use these two kinds of questions. First, divide the passage to be tested into chunks, one paragraph at a time. Long paragraphs can be divided. Then read the paragraph and ask the overview questions. Next, ask the detail questions. You may need to reread the passage one or two sentences at a time. This is especially true if people are having a hard time remembering or answering the questions. Detail questions will be different for different passages and will depend on the content of the passages. But overview questions can actually be the same. Two good overview questions for any passage are, what was the passage about? This question will help you see if the main point was understood. Another question, was there anything in the passage that confused you or that you didn't understand? Now this question does start focusing on details of anything that was unclear. Now for detail questions. Detail questions should focus on areas that are potentially unclear or unnatural. So these are often things that you as the translators have identified in advance as places where the audience may not understand the text. Detailed questions will often focus on things understood by the original audience that may need to be made explicit for today's audience and culture. So for instance, you have been translating the Good Samaritan story. In that story, a lawyer asks Jesus, who is his neighbor? Jesus gives a story talking about a man who was attacked by robbers, and two fellow Jews do not stop to help him, but a Samaritan does. Now, to understand the main point of Jesus' story about who is a good neighbor, we need to make sure the audience understands the relationship between the Jews and the Samaritans. The original audience knew that they were enemies. They did not get along at all. And yet the Samaritan stopped and helped the man, the Jew, who was hurt. And the other two Jewish leaders did not. So, for instance, making that relationship explicit in your text might help make that text more clear for your target audience. One translation says, a despised Samaritan comes along. And by adding that one word, that can make the whole point of Jesus' parable clear. Who is a neighbor? It was not the men's fellow countrymen or priests or leaders. It was an enemy, a despised Samaritan. So questions can focus on what your audience is understanding in order to make sure the main meaning is coming through. Now, in general, don't ask detailed questions for which answers can already be found in the text. Why not? In the past, some trainers did teach that you should ask questions about details that were already in the text. Who, what, when, where. But why not? Why should we not ask questions about what's already clear in the text? Well, it then becomes more a test of the helper's memory instead of what is clear or not clear. If he can't answer the questions and you reread to him something that was clearly in the text, well, that makes him look bad or feel stupid. And then the helper feels like he is being tested rather than the translation. Oh, he didn't get the answer right because he forgot that detail. And then he feels bad and it can shame him. We tell him that we are testing the translation and not him or his ability. And yet, if it is on questions that are already clearly in the text and he misses that, then he feels like he's being tested. So it's better to focus on areas that are potentially unclear in order to see if he'll understand those or not. That is a better way to help us actually improve the translation and make changes that will make the text better. So in summary, you should only prepare community testing questions on what is potentially unclear, where a change might be needed. Questions starting with why are often good to see if people understand the implications. Although at other times you can still check to see if details are clear using who, what, when, and where. And remember that the areas that are potentially unclear are those places that might have been understood to the original audience who lived long ago in a distant place with a different Jewish culture that might not be understood in today's culture. So focus on those areas for your detail questions. We're now going to look at a couple examples of detail questions for the Good Samaritan story. In Luke 10:25, it says, "Behold, a lawyer stood up to put Jesus to the test, asking him what he must do to inherit eternal life." Now, in verse 25, that word lawyer could potentially be unclear. And we want to see how our audience understands this word lawyer, because it should not be someone who tries a case in a court of law, but it was instead someone who was an expert in religious law. So you could ask for community testing, what kind of person asked Jesus a question? So that is a good question. It's not a yes-no question. It is requiring them to show what their understanding is of this word lawyer. Now in verse 26, Jesus responds, "What is written in the law?" And that word law could also potentially be unclear. It was not referring to political law here, but religious law, the law of Moses, given by God for the Jewish people. So, for a detailed question to ask in the community, you could say, what kind of law is being referred to here? And see how people are understanding that term, or whether it might be better to make it more explicit that it is religious law, what is written in Moses' law. On the next several slides, we'll be going over different kinds of things that detailed questions can be about. For example, unknown ideas. Now, in verse 35 of the Good Samaritan story, if you were translating from a literal version, you might have something like, "And the next day, the Samaritan man took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper." Now, to find out whether the translation of denarii is clear, you might ask, what did the Samaritan give to the innkeeper? A further question might be, what was the approximate value of the denarii? Now, to the original audience, they knew and understood what a denarii was. But for today's audience, the meaning might not be clear. Other versions here make it more clear by saying 2 silver coins. Or you could put 2 silver coins worth about 2 days' wages. Or that information could go in a footnote. But that would be a way of making a text, an unknown idea, clear for today's audience. Another area where meaning could potentially be unclear for today's audience would have to do with cross-cultural differences. So for instance, in verse 34, the text says that the Samaritan went to the man who had been beaten by robbers and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. So the Jewish custom of treating wounds with oil and wine may be strange to your audience today. So you might ask them for verse 34, why did the Samaritan pour oil and wine on the man's wounds? If it's not clear, you might need to make that more explicit. The reason why the oil and wine was used. For instance, CEV says, he treated his wounds with olive oil and wine. That helps make the meaning more clear for today's audience. Detail questions can also be about key terms. Remember that key terms are important words in the Bible, and we want to make sure that they are clearly understood, especially by those who are not believers and who may not be familiar with church language. So, for example, in verse 25, the religious teacher asks Jesus, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" To explore if the meaning of that key term, eternal life, is clear, you might ask, what does this term mean to you? Or in verse 31, the text says a priest happened to be going down the same road. To find out whether the translation of priest is clear, you might ask, what do you understand by the term priest? What kinds of things do priests do? So you're not just asking a yes-no question, do you understand this word priest? And they would probably just say yes. But you're trying to find out what they understand by this key term, priest. And then that will help you see whether or not they clearly understand this term as people in the source culture did. Detail questions can also be about figures of speech. The words in a figure of speech might communicate meaning clearly in one culture, but not to another. So for example, in verse 30, perhaps you translated like literal versions, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell into the hands of robbers." So in community testing, you could ask, what does it mean that the man fell into the hands of robbers? Another way to ask this might be, please show or explain to me what you think happened. So if falling into the hands of someone isn't clearly communicating the right meaning in your target audience, you could replace that figure of speech with the direct meaning. The man was attacked by robbers. Detail questions can also be about participant reference, to make sure your audience is clearly understanding who is doing what. So for instance, after telling this long parable or story, Jesus concludes by saying, "Which of these three do you think proved neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers?" 37, he said, "The one who showed mercy on him." In verse 36, you could ask, who is being spoken to where it says, "Who do you think?" Who is that you referring to? And in verse 37, who is speaking where it says, "He said, the one who showed mercy on him"? We've just been talking about participants in the story, and now it might not be so clear that Jesus is concluded the story and is now speaking to someone else. So a way to do this might be to make the participants more clear and say something like, "Then Jesus asked the expert in religious law, which one of these proved to be a real neighbor to the man who was beaten by the robbers." By clearly identifying the participants, now there is no question on who is being referred to. Here is a caution on the types of questions to avoid. Avoid questions that are long and complicated. Those will be hard for the people to respond to. And don't ask questions as if you expect a certain answer. For example, don't ask, "The Jews despised the Samaritans, didn't they?" You'll probably always receive the answer, yes, even if they really weren't sure. A better question would be, what was the relationship between the Jews and the Samaritans? Now, in general, avoid using questions that can be answered with yes or no. For example, is that clear? Or, does that sound good? And if the answer to a detail question that maybe you've prepared in advance has already been mentioned in a retelling or in response to an overview question, then don't ask it. Why not? Well, the testing time with the helper isn't about, it's about getting the right information. It's not about checking off items that were on your list. So if something has already been made clear through a prior question or retelling, then you wouldn't have to ask that again. So here are some examples of questions for this passage that are not good questions. So you can pause after each one and discuss, why aren't these good questions? The first, where was the man going from Jerusalem? Well, not a good question because the text already makes clear that he was going to Jericho. What time of day was he traveling? Well, also not a good question because the text doesn't say what time of day it happened, and it's not important to the story anyway. We don't need to ask our helpers trick questions. Another one, what did the robbers do to him? Well, not a good question because it's already clear in the text that they attacked him, stripped him of his clothes, and beat him. It might be hard for a helper to remember all three of those, but it is clear in the text. Did a priest also go down that road? Not such a good question because it's a yes-no question, and the answer is already clear in the text. What about this one? A Jewish priest should have helped a fellow Jew, shouldn't he? Well, this question is expecting a certain answer. Now, a better question might be, why would those listening to Jesus' story have expected a Jewish priest to help the injured man? In asking questions for community testing, you need to find which questions work best. Warning, testing can take a lot of time. There is a document that has been produced with testing questions for Luke. But there are 52 pages of questions for just chapters 1 through 9. Now those testing questions were written according to the old style, questions for which the answer is already clear in the text. Well, it can take significant time to write out questions in advance, and it can take significant time to do testing with multiple people. If huge amounts of time and effort are being invested with little payback, such as questions on things which are already clear in the text, well then that's not a good method to use. Always consider which questions get good feedback, which improve the clarity and naturalness of your translation. And then spend time focusing on those kinds of questions. On this slide and the next one, I have a couple of questionable questions. So is the following question a good question or not? What do you think? What kind of oil did the man pour on the wounds? Good question or not a good question? Well, the kind of oil is not mentioned in the source text. And the kind of oil isn't as important in the story as what the oil was used for. Now, on the other hand, if people understood that he poured on motor oil, well, that wouldn't be correct. And so we do have some versions which make explicit that he poured on olive oil to avoid that misunderstanding. But a better question might be, why did the Samaritan pour oil on the man's wounds? If it's not clear to your audience, then you might need to make explicit that the oil was used as a type of medicine or for healing. in that culture. Here are some other questionable questions. Do you think they are good questions or not? How do you think the people listening to the story felt about priests, about Levites, about Samaritans? Good questions or not? Well, the answers are not in the text, but it's actually crucial information in order to properly understand the story. The audience needs to understand that the Jewish priests and the Jewish Levites, or temple helpers, were leaders that should have helped their fellow Jewish man on the road. And they should understand that Samaritans were enemies and despised by the Jews. Once that is clear or made clear in the translation, then the point of the story becomes more clear. Now, before going out to do community testing, it's helpful to prepare your questions in advance, and especially the detailed questions. So look through the passage in advance and write questions for any place the text might be unclear. Now, potential places where the text might be unclear would be figures of speech, unknown ideas, key terms, participant reference, cultural differences, and implicit information, things that were known to the source audience that might not be known to your target audience today. So write down those detailed questions in advance to make sure that these kinds of things will be clear to your audience. Now, at times, the people you are testing your translation with will give you what you consider to be a wrong answer, and that can show you where your text might need to be improved. But sometimes they clearly have given a wrong answer when the text should be already clear. So what different reasons might there be for a wrong answer? Well, at times a wrong answer might come from a wrong question. Maybe you need to ask the question differently. Or perhaps the question was unclear or too complicated. Perhaps the question was slanted, anticipating a certain answer. The helper might be unsure what is wanted. They might be guessing at what you're trying to, the meaning you're trying to get after. So explain what you want him to do or demonstrate. The helper might be tired or just plain uninterested. In that case, try again later or find another helper. And the helper might not be capable for the task. So we know that some people do, for instance, well at school and get good grades, and other people do not do so well. They get poor grades. So for them, following even simple explanations or answering simple questions can be difficult. And if so, that's okay. Just try to find another helper who has an average intelligence and would be able to answer your questions. On the other hand, a reason for a wrong answer could be that the text is unclear or unnatural, and it needs to be changed. Think about what might be confusing to the helper. Is it something in the immediate context, such as a word or expression or idiom or a logical connector? Or is it that some implicit information he doesn't know has led him to a wrong conclusion? It's not just what a helper might say that could indicate a problem. There's other signs of problems as well. So observe the helper carefully when asking questions for hesitations or side comments to someone else who is also there, or if they have difficulty in reading the text, or their body language. All of these are clues that there may be a problem in the translation. Hard to identify problems. If you sense there is a problem, but it's hard to identify what it is, well, try rereading the passage. Ask follow-up questions on words or expressions that might be unclear. And encourage discussion. Often it's when you take time to discuss and talk about what the problems might be or a potential better way to make something more clear that you can find helpful answers to improve the text. Putting your helpers at ease, those with whom you are testing your translation. Remember, when asking questions, it's important to put your helpers at ease. Make sure they know it's the translation that's being tested and not them or their memory or their ability. Tell them if the answer is not clear, the fault is probably with the translation, and that your purpose in doing this testing is to find places where you can improve the translation. The community testing time is primarily a time for you, the translators, to listen to people in the village about your translation. Community testing isn't a time to teach and explain. You're not leading a Bible study. Now, of course, you have to be sensitive to God's Spirit, and there will be times when you can explain passages to unbelievers. But that should not be taking up the majority of your time. Community testing is a time for you to ask and listen and learn. The goal is to improve the translation. There will be future opportunities to teach the scriptures once they are published. Once again, a reminder, community testing is generally with unbelievers, and the purpose is to see if the text is clear and natural. You're not checking for accuracy. Therefore, those who are helping you should not be comparing the text against the National Version. Now, of course, you as translators should always use your Bibles while testing to make sure that any proposed changes to the text are clear, natural, and accurate. In our first teaching on community testing, we talked about the retell test, telling again a passage in your own words. And so far in this presentation, we've talked about using questions to test the translation to make sure it's clear and natural. Now would be a good time to have a demonstration of the question method. So I'd like you, if you are in a classroom setting, to choose someone to help test your translation and explain to him what you will be doing. Then read to him a short passage. Ask him overview questions, and then ask detailed questions, reading sentences again if necessary. Note down any places that were unclear or unnatural. So you can take a few minutes and go ahead and do that exercise, and then we'll be working through something very similar together. So here is an exercise on the question method. I want us to read together Luke 11, verses 14 through 19, and we'll do that on the following slide. And then discuss what would be some good overview questions and what would be some good detail questions. So we'll practice that together. So here is Luke 11, 14 through 19 in the RSV version, which is a fairly literal version, which I've chosen so that there will be several things that might not be easy to understand. So let's read this together. Now he was casting out a demon that was dumb. When the demon had gone out, the dumb man spoke, and the people marveled. But some of them said, "He casts out demons by Beelzebul, the prince of demons." While others, to test him, sought from him a sign from heaven. But he, knowing their thoughts, said to them, Every kingdom divided against itself is laid waste, and a divided household falls. And if Satan also is divided against himself, how will his kingdom stand? For you say that I cast out demons by Beelzebul. And if I cast out demons by Beelzebul, by whom do your sons cast them out? Therefore they shall be your judges. So what would be some good overview questions for this passage? Remember, we discussed earlier, you could ask, what is this passage about? Was there anything that confused you or that you didn't understand? Now let's look at detailed questions for each verse one at a time. What about for verse 14? What would be some good detail questions? Well, one might be, who is casting out a demon? It just says he was casting out a demon. And if this is at the start of a new section, your readers might not understand who the participant is here who is being referred to. If they don't, several versions do make clear, now Jesus was casting out a demon. And then it says, a demon that was dumb. What does that mean for them, that a demon was dumb? In English, dumb often means stupid or without intelligence. Is that the correct meaning here for this demon? If people do not understand this clearly, some versions make clear that the demon was mute or could not talk. And then, is it the demon who was mute and could not speak? Or was it the man that he was in who was unable to speak? So, for instance, NLT and CEV say that Jesus cast out a demon from a man who could not speak. So, important things to clarify and see how people understand the meaning on those. Now for verse 15, what would be a good detail question there? Well, the text says he casts out demons by Beelzebul. Does your audience know who Beelzebul is? The original Jewish audience did. Well, if it's not clear to them, for instance, NLT there puts cast out demons by Satan. Other versions use a footnote there to inform their audience that Beelzebul is another name for Satan. What about good detailed questions for verse 16? There it says, others to test him sought from him a sign from heaven. So you could ask, what does a sign from heaven mean? If it's not clear, NLT says a miraculous sign from heaven to prove his authority. So they made it clear by adding to prove his authority. GNT says a miracle to show God approved of him. So they left out heaven and replaced that with God, a miracle to show God approved of him. CEV just says a sign from God. So if that would make it more clear, if it's not to your audience, those would be ways that you could change the text. What about verse 17? Every kingdom divided against itself is laid waste. So you could ask, what does that mean to be laid waste? In what kinds of situations do we use that word? Well, here GNT says will not last very long, or CEV will end up in ruin. So those might be more clear ways to express the meaning. At the end of 17, a divided household falls. If that figure of speech to a household falling is not clear, GNT says falls apart, or CEV says will break up. What about writing detailed questions for verse 18? It says, if Satan also is divided against himself, how will his kingdom stand? So you could ask, is it possible or clear how a single person could be divided against himself? If that's not, G&T says, so if Satan's kingdom has groups fighting each other, that might be more clear. And what about verse 19? If I cast out demons by Beelzebul, by whom do your sons cast them out? So who does your sons refer to? That could be a question, a detailed question to ask. If it's not clear to your audience, many English versions, instead of your sons, put your followers. By whom do your followers cast them out? So those are some examples of the kind of detailed questions that could be asked, or areas to focus on when doing community testing, where the meaning of the text could be unclear to your audience. Now you would prepare the detailed questions in advance, so you're ready to ask them once you get out to the village area to do the testing. Other methods for testing. In addition to the two main testing methods, tell it again and using questions, some other methods might be useful in some situations. Listening to others read, alternate renderings, trial editions. We'll go over these on the next slides. Back translation and read aloud. Remember, we said you need to find the method of testing that works best for you in your situation with your people. The best method is the one that gives the most helpful feedback for the time you invest in it. So listening to others read. For this, you need people who can read the language fluently. Ask different people to read. If a number of people stumble at the same place, that can show a potential problem in your translated text. If people read something different than what is written, that can also show a place that is not very natural. Alternate renderings. As you translate, there may be places where you're not sure which of two renderings is best. So that's a good place to ask questions and find out which rendering is more clear and natural for people. For instance, idioms or figures of speech and key terms. Note down the alternatives for testing. You might read them both and ask, which of these sounds better? Or what is the difference in meaning between these two expressions? Now, offering alternatives encourages people to think about which is better, and also to think of other ways to express the meaning. Maybe they will think of something that's better than either of the initial alternatives that you suggested. Trial editions. After publishing or recording a book, it's good to still think of it as a trial edition, even though it's already been consultant checked. As it's used, for instance, in the church, invite feedback. If improvements are suggested, they can be incorporated before publishing the complete New Testament. Now, subsequent changes that involve exegesis or key terms must be passed by the consultant. However, if there are just slight changes for naturalness or clarity, which don't change the meaning, then they don't necessarily need to be passed by the consultant. Back translation, which is step 7 in our 10 steps of translation, is another way to test and improve the text. Now, a back translation is a literal retranslation into another language, usually the national language. And if done by a mother tongue speaker who is not already familiar with the Bible text, it reveals what that speaker understands of the translation. So if something in the text is unclear to the person who is making the back translation or unnatural, he can point that out to one of the translators. The text can then be improved before it comes to the consultant. A read aloud is another way to test the translation. Reading the translation out loud can show places that are incorrect or unnatural. It's especially helpful when preparing for oral recording. It's a simple test, but a very effective one. Now, although the final read aloud is step 9 in the 10 steps of translation, it can be done multiple times. For instance, by the translator after making the first draft, or during the team check, or when doing community testing, to family and friends, and then at the very end again, right before publication. So as I've said before, you need to find out what methods of testing work best. Which methods give you the most helpful feedback for improving your translation? Perhaps the retell test, or using questions, listening to others read, alternate renderings, trial editions, or a combination of those. It's good to use several different methods when testing. So find the best methods that work the best for you in your situation. And those might not be the same for each team. Different teams may find that different things work better for them. Find the ones that give you the most helpful feedback for improving your translation. Doing community testing could take a huge amount of time. So you really want to make sure that the time you invest is producing helpful changes. At this point, if we were holding the class together rather than virtually, I would ask an experienced translator from a project related to yours to come and share with you for 5 minutes about his experience with community testing. Some teams have found some things helpful, other teams have found others. It would benefit you to talk with other translators in your area and see what has worked well for them and what has not worked so well. In steps 1 to 3, the team has worked themselves on the translation. In steps 4 and 5, they have tested the translation with other speakers of the language. And now it's time to start getting the text ready for a consultant check. In order to do that, the next step is step 6, basic scripture checks. We'll talk about that next time. So that is the end of today's teaching on using questions to test your translation in the community. May the Lord give you His wisdom and His Spirit as you seek to polish and improve your translation, and as you share it with others out in the village area. Have a good day. See you next time. If you're taking this training as part of a translation workshop, you'll see in the green box on the workshop schedule that we've just finished our second presentation on Step 5, Community Testing, using questions and other methods. In our next class session, the box in red, you'll have time to work in your language teams on preparing testing questions for Luke 10:25 to 37. So prepare both overview and detail questions for that passage, focusing especially on places the translation might be unclear to your target audience. And then go ahead and practice asking those questions to your team. So having someone on the team who is asking the others who will act as the audience or the villagers questions about the clarity of your translation. So that is your assignment for the next class period.